Warning! This episode contains discussion of political policy, executive authority, national security, and acts of violence currently under investigation. Viewer discretion is advised, especially for listeners sensitive to discussions involving shootings, criminal allegations, or media criticism. Our goal is not sensationalism. It's clarity, context, and truth. Facts matter. Accountability matters. And silence, when it protects power, matters too.
Wednesday night, Trump addressed the nation. Not from a rally stage, not from a campaign backdrop, not from behind a flurry of applause lines, but directly, calmly, and deliberately at a moment when the country feels like it's being pulled in a dozen different directions at once. At the same time, Donald Trump signed an executive order undoing decades of federal drug policy dogma, moving marijuana out of Schedule 1 and into Schedule 3. A shift that career politicians talked about for years, but never had the nerve to actually do. And while Washington debated policy and pundits scrambled to frame intent, gunfire echoed through yet another elite American campus, Brown University, forcing the same institutions that preach safety and control to answer a question they keep dodging. Why does violence keep finding places that promise it never will? Tonight, we're not reacting to headlines. We're dissecting decisions. We're not chasing outrage. We're tracking patterns. From executive authority and federal reform, to a presidential address that didn't sound panicked, to a university shooting that the media seemed unusually careful about how it described. This episode is about contrast. Who speaks clearly? Who hesitates? Who acts? And who stays silent long enough for a narrative to be built before the facts can interfere. So tonight, we're pulling these threads together. Power, policy, violence, and selective silence. Not to inflame, but to expose. Because when leadership shows up, chaos loses ground. And when facts threaten narratives, the truth usually arrives last, unless someone insists on bringing it forward. All right, let's bring in the crew, because if we're going to break down executive power, national leadership, campus chaos, and media selective silence, I'm not doing it alone, and I'm definitely not doing it gently. First up, firing on all cylinders as always, is Brian, the engine of MAGA Fire Friday, running hot on principle, sarcasm, and a deep, unapologetic belief that America works best when leaders lead and excuses get thrown out with yesterday's press releases. If there's hypocrisy in the room, Brian's already pointed at it, named it, and lit it on fire. Next is Rachel, our independent voice in a media ecosystem that pretends balance is a crime. She's here to separate emotional spin from actual outcomes, to ask the questions that neither side likes answering, and to remind everyone that facts don't belong to parties. They belong to the people willing to look at them honestly. Then we've got Daniel, the man who doesn't just read the headlines. He reads the footnotes, the omissions, and the quiet coordination behind the scenes. When stories feel oddly delayed, strangely framed, or suspiciously incomplete, Daniel's already connecting dots that were never meant to be on the same page. And rounding out the table is Skylar, bringing the progressive perspective whether the room is comfortable with it or not. She's here to challenge enforcement-first thinking, push back on conservative assumptions, and argue for social responsibility, mental health reform, and public safety. Especially when power shifts hands and consequences get real. And I'm Artie, your host, here to cut through the noise, call out the double standards, and make sure we don't mistake volume for truth or silence for innocence. This isn't about left versus right. It's about who acts, who hides, and who benefits when the public isn't paying attention. This is Data and Dissonance. Let's start with the executive order that just upended 50 years of federal drug policy. Let's start with something that caught a lot of people flat-footed. Not because it came out of nowhere, but because the person who finally pulled the trigger wasn't supposed to. This week, President Trump signed an executive order moving marijuana from Schedule 1, the same federal category as heroin, to Schedule 3, a classification reserved for substances with accepted medical use and significantly lower abuse potential. This is not federal legalization. This is not a free-for-all. But it is the single most meaningful shift in federal drug policy in over half a century. And it came from the same man the media has spent years calling a prohibitionist authoritarian. For decades, politicians from both parties talked about reform. They held hearings, they floated bills, they tweeted compassion, and then they did nothing. Trump didn't make a speech about it. He signed the order. And suddenly the same outlets that demanded reform are tripping over themselves trying to explain why this doesn't count, why it's dangerous, or why they're uncomfortable applauding something they asked for simply because they don't like who delivered it. So tonight, we're not debating stoner culture or campaign slogans. We're talking about policy, consequences, and why this move rewrites the political map in ways a lot of people weren't prepared for. Brian, I'm coming to you first.
Artie, this is exactly why the political class hates Trump. Because he doesn't just steal their talking points, he steals their excuses. For years, Democrats claimed ownership of criminal justice reform, medical marijuana, and compassion policy, while conservatives were painted as rigid dinosaurs clinging to outdated laws. And yet here we are, watching a Republican president actually dismantle one of the most absurd classifications in federal law. Not with a press tour, but with a pen. Schedule 1 was always a joke. Anyone with half a brain knew marijuana didn't belong next to heroin and LSD, and keeping it there wasn't about science, it was about control and bureaucracy protecting itself. What really matters here is that Trump did this without federalizing culture. He didn't impose legalization from Washington. He didn't trample states' rights. He didn't pretend weed was harmless candy. He acknowledged medical reality, loosened federal restrictions, opened the door for research, banking access, and sentencing reform, and then stepped back. That's conservative governance. That's how reform is supposed to work. And the left can't stand it because it proves you don't need chaos, riots, or moral lectures to change policy. You need leadership and follow-through.
And that's the part nobody wants to say out loud. This wasn't radical. It was restrained. Rachel, from an independent lens, this move landed differently than people expected. What stood out to you?
What stood out to me is how overdue this was and how quietly revolutionary it still is. Schedule 1 classification didn't just criminalize possession, it strangled research. Doctors couldn't properly study medical applications. Veterans struggled to access alternatives for pain and PTSD. Researchers jumped through insane hoops just to run controlled trials. Moving marijuana to Schedule 3 doesn't magically fix everything, but it removes the federal chokehold that kept science frozen in the 1970s, while real-world use moved on without it. From an independent standpoint, this also exposes a lot of performative politics. Democrats talked endlessly about compassion, but never prioritized the actual administrative changes needed to make progress. Republicans talked about law and order, but often avoided reform entirely. Trump cut through both, not because he's trying to win over activists, but because the classification was indefensible. And when policy finally aligns with reality, people notice, especially voters who are tired of speeches and allergic to results that never arrive.
Daniel, this is where I know your antennae go up. Because moves like this don't happen in a vacuum. Timing matters. Pressure matters. Who's nervous right now?
Everyone who benefited from the old system, Artie. Pharmaceutical companies, private prison interests, federal agencies that justified budgets on enforcement instead of outcomes. Schedule 1 status wasn't just outdated, it was profitable for the right people. It allowed selective enforcement, inflated arrest numbers, and kept alternative treatments locked behind regulatory walls. Moving marijuana to Schedule 3 doesn't just signal compassion. It threatens revenue streams and institutional inertia that rely on prohibition staying messy and unresolved. And the timing, that's not accidental. This comes as trust in institutions is collapsing, as Americans are questioning why certain laws exist at all, and as Trump is repositioning himself not as a disruptor, but as a stabilizer. He's saying, we can fix broken systems without burning the house down. That scares people whose power depends on confusion, moral panic, and endless half measures. Watch who downplays this move. It tells you exactly who loses leverage.
Skylar, from the progressive side, there's been cautious praise mixed with skepticism. Where does this land for you?
I'll give credit where it's due. Reclassifying marijuana is a necessary step, and it should have happened years ago. The damage done by over-criminalization is real, and marginalized communities paid the highest price for policies that never matched scientific reality. That said, Schedule 3 still keeps marijuana under federal control, still limits full access, and still leaves room for selective enforcement if leadership changes. Again, progressives worry, with reason, that reform without broader systemic protections can be reversed or unevenly applied. What I want to see next is accountability and consistency. Medical access should be equitable. Research should be transparent. Sentencing relief should be retroactive where appropriate. This move opens the door, but it doesn't finish the job. The question now is whether this administration follows through, or whether political pressure freezes progress again once the headlines fade.
And that's the irony. The man accused of authoritarian instincts just loosened federal drug policy more than anyone in modern history, while the people who promised reform are still explaining why action makes them uncomfortable. This wasn't culture war politics. This was administrative reality finally catching up to the world outside Washington. And whether people like Trump or not, the scoreboard just changed. When we come back, we're shifting from executive action to executive voice, breaking down Trump's address to America on December 17th, what it signaled, why the tone mattered, and why the reaction said more than the speech itself. Stay with us.
Tired of thinking for yourself? Exhausted by facts ruining a perfectly good narrative? Then you need Narrative, the only all-natural, media-approved explanation for everything. Side effects may include selective outrage, delayed reporting, sudden concern for due process, and the uncontrollable urge to say it's too early to speculate, even when it's not. Narrative. If you don't like the facts, we'll fix them for you. Now available in classic, election year, and ongoing investigation flavors.
Narrative not approved by critical thinkers. May cause reality withdrawal.
Narrative. Because silence works best when everyone agrees.
Wednesday night, Americans didn't hear a rally speech. They didn't hear a campaign pitch. They didn't hear a grievance list or a nickname parade. What they heard was a direct address. Measured, controlled, and unmistakably deliberate. President Trump spoke to the nation at a moment when confidence in institutions is low. Public trust feels fractured, and the media seems more interested in interpreting tone than analyzing substance. And that alone should tell you something. This address wasn't designed to electrify a base. It was designed to stabilize a country. The pacing was slower. The language was firmer. The message was simple. Order matters, borders matter, safety matters, and leadership doesn't panic just because the noise gets loud. Whether people liked the message or not, it was unmistakably presciential. And the reaction to it exposed just how uncomfortable some people are when authority sounds calm instead of chaotic. Brian, let's start with you.
Artie, the first thing that hit me wasn't what Trump said. It was what he didn't do. No shouting, no insults, no improvising. This was a man who knew exactly why he was speaking and who he was speaking to. For years, the left tried to brand Trump as unstable, impulsive, and incapable of restraint. And then he delivers a speech that feels like it came straight out of an old-school Oval Office playbook. Calm, unapologetic, and grounded in authority. That alone breaks the narrative. But the content matters too. He didn't apologize for enforcing the law. He didn't pretend the border is a misunderstanding. He didn't sugarcoat public safety or national security. He framed strength as responsibility, not aggression. And that's something Americans haven't heard in a long time. The media wanted fireworks. What they got was confidence. And that scares people who thrive on panic and outrage cycles.
That contrast is huge. Calm leadership versus manufactured chaos. Rachel, from an independent standpoint, how did this land with voters who aren't emotionally invested in Trump one way or the other?
What stood out to me was tone discipline. Independents aren't looking for heroes or villains, they're looking for competence. And this address sounded like someone who understands the weight of the office, not just the thrill of holding it. Trump spoke in a way that didn't demand applause or agreement. He laid out priorities and expected adults to process them. That alone resets expectations in a political environment that's been addicted to spectacle. I also think this speech quietly repositioned Trump. Instead of reacting to criticism, he spoke above it. He didn't chase every controversy. He didn't over-explain. He trusted the audience to follow along. And for independents who tune out cable news but still care deeply about stability, that matters. You don't have to love every policy to recognize when leadership feels grounded instead of performative.
Daniel, this address didn't happen in a vacuum. Timing, delivery, and follow-up all matter. What does this signal to you?
This speech was a signal, Artie, not just to voters, but to institutions. Trump wasn't talking to Twitter or late-night comedians. He was talking to governors, agency heads, foreign observers, and bureaucrats who've gotten used to ambiguity and drift. When a president speaks calmly while asserting authority, it tells the system that uncertainty is ending. That's why the reaction was so jittery in certain corners. The other thing that matters is sequencing. He delivers this address right after signing a meaningful executive order, reinforcing the idea that words are being paired with action. That combination is powerful. It's not emotional leadership, it's structural leadership. And historically, that's when resistance hardens, narratives tighten, and media framing becomes defensive instead of analytical.
Skylar, from the progressive side, there's concern about what firm language and enforcement actually mean in practice. How did this address land for you?
The tone was calmer than expected, and I think that's intentional. But calm authority can still produce real consequences. Progressives worry that speeches like this normalize enforcement-heavy approaches without fully addressing root causes like inequality, healthcare access, and mental health infrastructure. When a president emphasizes order and control, it raises legitimate questions about who bears the cost of that order. That said, I'll acknowledge something important. This speech wasn't reckless. It wasn't incendiary. It didn't call for chaos. And that makes the policy discussion more serious, not less. If this administration is going to push enforcement, it also needs to invest in prevention, services, and safeguards. Otherwise, calm rhetoric won't soften real-world impact.
And that's where the divide really is. Not between volume and silence, but between stability and trust. Trump's address didn't ask the country to panic, protest, or pick sides. It asked the country to listen. And whether people like the message or not, the reaction revealed something important. When leadership stops sounding frantic, the noise starts to expose itself. Up next, we turn from words to consequences. The latest verified updates from the Brown University shooting, what we know, what's being carefully framed, and why elite institutions always seem unprepared for the violence they insist can't happen. Stay with us.
At Prestige University, we believe safety is a feeling, not a result. That's why we've invested millions in banners, task forces, and inclusive language, instead of things that actually stop violence. And if something does happen, we promise a carefully worded statement within 48 hours, while asking the media to avoid speculation about facts already confirmed. Prestige University, where accountability is optional and security is a talking point.
Results may vary, safety not guaranteed, questions discouraged.
We're going to slow this down, deliberately. Because when it comes to violence, especially on elite campuses, speed is usually the enemy of truth. Earlier this week, gunfire erupted near the Brown University campus, triggering lockdowns, a heavy law enforcement response, and a flood of carefully worded statements that said a lot without actually saying much. What we've seen since then isn't just an investigation unfolding. It's a familiar pattern of selective urgency, delayed clarity, and narrative caution that always seems to surround incidents like this, when they happen in places that are supposed to represent intellectual safety and moral authority. Here's what matters. There was a shooting. People were hurt. Law enforcement responded quickly. A suspect was identified and taken into custody. And yet, details that would normally dominate headlines, motive, background, warning signs, institutional failures, have been handled with kid gloves. Not ignored exactly, but managed, softened, deferred. And that raises real questions about consistency, accountability, and why some tragedies are treated as national reckonings while others are handled like inconvenient interruptions. Brian, I'm coming to you first.
Artie, what drives people nuts isn't just the violence. It's the hypocrisy that follows it. Brown University, like so many elite campuses, has spent years telling everyone how enlightened, safe, and morally superior it is. Gun-free zones, mandatory trainings, endless panels about harm reduction, and then reality shows up anyway. And when it does, suddenly the script flips. Now it's too early to speculate. Now it's respect privacy. Now it's avoid politicization. Funny how those rules only apply sometimes. What also needs to be said is that these campuses refuse to confront the hard truth. Policies don't stop intent. Signs don't stop bullets. And pretending that danger can be legislated out of existence just leaves people defenseless when things go wrong. The focus should be on security failures, response time, and why institutions that lecture the country nonstop about safety always seem shocked when violence happens on their watch.
That shock always feels selective. Rachel, from an independent perspective, how should this be handled differently, both by the university and by the media?
The first thing that has to change is transparency. When incidents like this happen, people don't need perfectly polished statements. They need clear, factual timelines. What happened, when it happened, how law enforcement responded, and what's being investigated. That doesn't compromise due process. It builds trust. Right now, the drip-feed approach creates confusion and suspicion, especially when similar cases elsewhere are covered wall-to-wall within hours. I also think universities need to stop treating safety as a branding exercise. Students, faculty, and families deserve real preparedness, not just policies that look good in brochures. Mental health support, threat assessment, coordination with local police, those things matter more than slogans. And when something does happen, honesty matters more than optics.
Daniel, this is where your pattern radar usually lights up. What are you seeing in how this story has been handled?
I'm seeing containment, Artie, not of the suspect, but of the narrative. When details come out slowly and selectively, it's usually because institutions are trying to control downstream consequences. Brown isn't just a school. It's a brand, a donor network, and a cultural symbol. That doesn't mean facts are being hidden forever, but it does mean they're being paced, filtered, and contextualized in ways that minimize institutional fallout. We've seen this before. Early emphasis on no ongoing threat, careful language about identity, heavy focus on community healing before accountability. It's not a conspiracy, it's risk management. And the problem is that public trust erodes when people can tell they're being managed instead of informed.
Skylar, from the progressive side, campus shootings often reignite calls for policy reform. How do you view what happened here?
Campus violence is always a failure on multiple levels: personal, institutional, and societal. Progressives focus on prevention because reacting after the fact is never enough. That means serious investment in mental health services, early intervention, and credible threat reporting systems that students actually trust. Too often, warning signs are missed or dismissed because institutions are afraid of liability or bad press. That said, accountability has to be consistent. Elite campuses shouldn't get softer treatment just because they're elite. If policies didn't work, they should be evaluated honestly. If systems failed, they should be fixed, not explained away. Safety has to be real, not rhetorical.
And that's the common thread here. Not politics, but honesty. Violence doesn't care about prestige. Danger doesn't read mission statements. And trust evaporates when institutions seem more concerned with reputation than reality. The facts will come out. They always do. The question is whether the public will be given the full picture willingly, or only after the narrative has been safely constructed. Stay with us. Before we bring the panel back in, quick reminder that Data and Dissonance isn't backed by corporate sponsors, cable networks, or billionaire donors. This show is powered by listeners who are tired of being talked down to and ready to support independent voices that actually say something. If you want to rep that mindset, head over to the Data and Dissonance merch store, where we've got everything from our Gen X shirts, Make Orwell Fiction Again hoodies, and I Identify as Non-Binary bumper stickers, to our Data and Dissonance coffee blends. Light, medium, and dark roasts, all roasted in the USA and built for early mornings and late-night thinking. Every purchase helps keep this show independent, helps cover production costs, and helps us keep doing what legacy media won't: asking uncomfortable questions without asking permission first. The link is in the show notes, the description, and on our website. Support the show. Wear the message, drink the fuel. All right. Now that we've laid out the facts, the context, and the contradictions, it's time to give the panel the floor and let each of them dig deeper into what all of this actually means. No sound bites, no crosstalk, just long-form takes, perspective, and pushback. Because these stories don't exist in isolation, and neither do the consequences. We're going to go one by one. Same topics, different lenses. You'll hear where they agree, where they clash, and where the lines are being drawn. Not by politics, but by principle. Brian, you're up first.
Look, Artie, when you zoom out and stop letting cable news chop everything into 5-second panic clips, a really clear pattern jumps out: leadership versus performance. Trump didn't posture this week. He didn't float trial balloons or send out anonymous senior official leaks. He acted. He reclassified marijuana in a way that actually fixes a broken policy without turning the country upside down. And then he addressed the nation like a president who understands that calm authority is more powerful than noise. That's not chaos. That's control. And the people who hate him the most can't stand that he's starting to look boring in the best possible way. And then you look at Brown University, and it's the exact opposite energy. Years of lecturing America about safety, morality, and progress. And the moment real danger shows up, everything slows down. Suddenly, details are sensitive. Suddenly, we need time. Suddenly, the media is tripping over itself to remind us not to speculate, even when basic facts would already be public if this had happened anywhere else. That's not compassion, that's image management. And Americans are smart enough to see the difference. What frustrates people isn't disagreement, it's inconsistency. If the rules change based on zip code, donor class, or last name, then the rules aren't real. Trump's week exposed that contrast perfectly. You had decisive action at the federal level, clear communication from the Oval Office, and then total narrative paralysis when an elite institution faced real scrutiny. Leadership showed up in one place. Excuses showed up in another. And here's the thing the media really doesn't want to talk about. Voters aren't asking for perfection anymore. They're asking for honesty. They want to know who's willing to make a decision, own it, and deal with the fallout without hiding behind consultants and PR statements. Trump did that this week. Brown University didn't. And the press? They told on themselves by how carefully they tiptoed around it. That's why this stuff matters. Not because of party loyalty, but because it reveals who trusts the public with the truth and who doesn't. And if this week taught us anything, it's that calm leadership terrifies people who make their money selling chaos.
What struck me this week wasn't any single decision or speech. It was how differently institutions behave when they're confident in their authority versus when they're trying to protect their image. Trump's executive order on marijuana and his address to the nation both carried the same underlying message. This administration believes clarity is stabilizing, not dangerous. You may disagree with the policy or the priorities, but there was nothing evasive about it. The moves were direct, the language was measured, and the expectations were clear. That kind of leadership doesn't demand applause. It invites scrutiny. And that's actually healthy. Now contrast that with how the Brown University shooting has been handled. When information is filtered, delayed, or overly managed, it creates the exact opposite effect. People don't feel protected. They feel talked around. Transparency isn't about sensationalizing violence. It's about respecting the public enough to tell them what you know, when you know it. Elite institutions often forget that trust isn't built through prestige. It's built through consistency. And right now, the inconsistency is glaring. On the marijuana reclassification specifically, this was a rare moment where federal policy aligned with medical reality. Schedule 1 status didn't just criminalize users, it froze research and kept doctors in legal limbo. Moving marijuana to Schedule 3 doesn't solve every issue, but it removes a major barrier to science-based decision-making. And that matters far more than the political optics. Reform doesn't have to look radical to be real. Sometimes it just has to be honest. What I keep coming back to is accountability. Leadership means being willing to be judged on outcomes, not intentions. Trump put real policy on the table. Universities put statements on websites. The media decides which one deserves wall-to-wall analysis and which one gets a footnote. Independents see that difference clearly. And the longer institutions rely on narrative control instead of openness, the faster public trust erodes. This week wasn't about left versus right. It was about who trusts the public with the truth and who doesn't.
What interested me this week wasn't just what happened. It was how quickly certain systems went into defensive posture. When Trump reclassified marijuana, the reaction wasn't outrage from voters. It was discomfort from institutions. When he addressed the nation calmly and directly, the response wasn't debate over policy. It was immediate narrative framing about tone, implications, and what this really means. And when a shooting occurred near Brown University, the instinct wasn't transparency, it was containment. Different events, same reflex. That reflex is institutional self-preservation. Schedule. I was never about public safety. It was about leverage. It gave agencies enforcement power, pharmaceutical companies market protection, and universities a moral shield to talk about reform without touching funding pipelines. Moving marijuana to Schedule 3 doesn't just change a drug's classification. It disrupts a quiet ecosystem that thrived on ambiguity. That's why you saw muted praise and loud caveats instead of honest acknowledgement. The system doesn't panic when it's wrong. It panics when it loses control. Trump's address fits that same pattern. It wasn't emotionally reactive, so it couldn't be easily clipped or caricatured. Calm authority removes the usual attack vectors. When leadership doesn't flail, the media has to invent urgency somewhere else. And that's when you see fixation on phrasing instead of substance. That's not journalism, that's damage control. And then there's Brown. Elite institutions operate on reputation inertia. They assume credibility will buy them time, and usually it does. Details come out slowly, language is carefully curated, and responsibility is diffused through committees and statements. That doesn't mean there's a grand conspiracy. It means the same people trained to manage donors, lawsuits, and headlines are managing information flow. Transparency threatens stability. Delay protects it. What connects all of this is trust, or more accurately, who is trusted with the truth. This week showed a clear divide between leadership that believes the public can handle reality and institutions that assume the public needs to be managed. And every time facts are softened or delayed, people notice. They might not articulate it, but they feel it. That's the real story underneath all of this. Not chaos, not scandal, control. And who's losing it?
What I keep hearing tonight is a lot of praise for a calm authority, and I understand why that resonates. People are exhausted by chaos, but calm leadership doesn't automatically equal just outcomes, and that's where progressives start raising flags. When Trump reclassified marijuana, that was a necessary correction to a policy that caused real harm, especially to marginalized communities. But Schedule 3 still leaves marijuana under federal control, still creates uneven access, and still risks selective enforcement depending on who's in power. Reform that can be reversed isn't justice, it's probation. The address to the nation is similar. Tone matters, yes. Stability matters, but policy matters more. When a president emphasizes order, enforcement, and authority, people who've historically been on the wrong end of those systems hear something very different than reassurance. Calm language doesn't erase fear if the underlying systems haven't earned trust. Progressives worry about what happens after the speech, how enforcement is carried out, who gets protected, and who gets swept up in the process. And when it comes to Brown University, I agree with something everyone said tonight. Elite institutions shouldn't get a pass. But I don't think the answer is pretending security failures only exist on campuses that lean left. Violence is a national problem, and prevention requires more than armed responses and tougher rhetoric. Mental health systems are overwhelmed. Early warning systems are inconsistent, and too often institutions, whether universities or governments, react instead of investing in prevention before tragedy strikes. What I want to see is consistency. If we're going to praise leadership for decisive action, we also need to demand transparency, safeguards, and accountability that apply equally, regardless of ideology, prestige, or political convenience. Calm authority can be a strength, but only if it's paired with compassion that shows up in policy, not just tone.
Patriotism isn't about slogans, flags on social media profiles, or who shouts the loudest when the cameras are on. Real patriotism is quieter than that. It's about responsibility. The kind that shows up when decisions are hard, when consequences are real, and when leadership doesn't get to hide behind excuses. This week reminded us that America isn't held together by narratives or institutions. It's held together by people who believe the truth matters, even when it's uncomfortable. By leaders willing to act instead of posture. By citizens willing to ask questions instead of swallowing headlines. And by communities that demand accountability without abandoning compassion. Our system isn't perfect. It never has been. But it was built to be corrected, not burned down, not rewritten by force, and not protected by silence. Freedom survives because people are willing to defend it, improve it, and tell the truth about it, even when it costs them. That's what loving this country actually looks like. Not blind loyalty, not blind anger, but commitment to law, to liberty, and to each other. Tonight wasn't about whether you like Donald Trump. It wasn't about whether you support marijuana reform, trust elite universities, or agree with every word spoken in a presidential address. It was about something far more basic. Whether leadership still means acting clearly, telling the truth plainly, and trusting the American people enough to handle reality without being managed. This week showed us a contrast that's getting harder to ignore. On one side, you had decisive action, a federal drug policy correction that should have happened decades ago, and a calm address to the nation that didn't beg for applause or thrive on panic. On the other side, you had hesitation, narrative control, and institutions circling the wagons the moment accountability came knocking. And in between it all, you had the media, deciding which facts to amplify, which to delay, and which stories deserved oxygen based not on impact, but on comfort. Violence at Brown University reminded us of an uncomfortable truth. Prestige doesn't prevent danger, and slogans don't stop chaos. When institutions promise safety without preparing for reality, they fail the people they're supposed to protect. And when coverage feels cautious instead of candid, it sends a message that reputation sometimes matters more than transparency. Americans feel that, even if they can't always articulate it, they know when they're being talked around instead of spoken to. The arrest of Rob Reiner's son exposed another layer of that same problem. Not because of who his father is, but because of how differently stories are treated depending on who they might embarrass. Justice doesn't work if it's selective. Accountability doesn't exist if it's conditional. And trust doesn't survive when rules change based on last names or donor lists. Here's the reality. This country isn't falling apart because of disagreement. It's straining under the weight of double standards. People don't expect perfection. They expect honesty. They don't need leaders to be flawless. They need them to be present, clear, and willing to own decisions when they make them. America doesn't need more noise. It needs more adults in the room, more courage to act, more willingness to tell the truth before it's convenient, and more respect for a public that's far more capable of critical thought than it's given credit for. That's what we try to do here. Not tell you what to think, but refuse to insult your intelligence while the facts are unfolding. Remember to speak truth. Stir thought. Tonight's episode of Data and Dissonance is brought to you by the Caleb Rourke Thriller series. High-stakes political thrillers written for readers who like their fiction grounded in reality and their heroes unwilling to play along. If you're tired of sanitized villains, predictable plots, and stories that pretend power is harmless, start with The Covenant Protocol, where intelligence failures, shadow networks, and buried truths collide in a world that feels uncomfortably close to our own. Follow it up with The Prophet Directive, and keep an eye out for Black Echo Rising, the next chapter in the series that pushes the stakes even higher. Available now on Amazon Kindle, with links in the show notes and episode description. If you enjoy Data and Dissonance, you'll feel right at home inside the world of Caleb Rourke.